Hello everybody, I'm back again with a real-time video with voiceover. I recently bought a set of Acryla Gouache and I've been experimenting with it, using it as an underpainting, and I've had fairly successful results. So I figured I'd share a real-time video of me using it. In this case, I'm using two different colors. I'm using a turquoise blue as the underpainting for the background. So I'd wet the paper fully and then using my regular watercolor brush to pick up some Acryla Gouache, and I'm making a light wash with it. It's important to rinse your brush thoroughly when you're using Acryla Gouache because once it dries permanently, and it'll be a little hard to get it out of your brush if you leave it long. For the foreground, just to infuse some light, I have chosen to use deep yellow for the underpainting. The paper I'm using is by Bauhong. It's hot pressed, and I was very happy with the results. Just adding a touch more. Ideally, it would make sense to use a ceramic plate to make washes or mixes with the Acrylic Wash, but since I was a little in the gap, I just went ahead and used that. So in case you were curious, the tape that I've used here is by Blick Art Materials, and I'm very happy with the tape. It gives me very clean edges. So I waited for the entire first layer to dry. The thing with Acrylic Wash is that once it dries permanently, so there is no worry about activating your base layers once you start painting over it. So now over this Acrylic Wash, I'm going to go ahead and paint with watercolors. Since the Acrylic Wash was a very thin layer, I didn't find any issues painting over it. In a piece I did yesterday, I put on a thicker layer of Acrylic Wash and I had a little trouble layering over it with watercolor. So I'm yet to do more experiments, but I would think that keeping the layer thin is probably key for your underpainting. So here I'm using watercolors by Cheap Joe's Art Stuff. This is American Journey, and the color I'm using here is Ward Jeans Dusty Green. As you can see, the more I'm putting down, the background layer just stays put. And I really found this a wonderful way to work. Also, the lightest colors that you will see are now the colors of the underpainting. The watercolor is no longer reflecting off of the white of the paper. It's going to reflect your base layer, which is your Acrylic Gouache here. So I realized I could just wet the whole thing and get a smoother blend that way. Just refining the shape of the background tree line, punching up the colors a little because it's going to dry light anyway. Not covering the entire background because I did want some of the blue to show through. But even if you cover it, the underpainting will still shine through. Watercolors are transparent, so you can always see the layers below them. So even if you were to cover the full underpainting, it would still establish a mood for your piece. If you were to use a yellow, it'll probably be nice and bright and glow with that. And once you use a blue underpainting, it kind of lends a very moody feel to the piece. I'll show you a picture of another piece that I made at the end of this video. Now I was just going back in and adding darker greens. This is Earthen Green, but again by American Journey. The composition is fairly similar to my golden hour landscape. So if you want to go ahead and watch that video, please feel free to do so. I'm now putting in some darks. This is Payne's Gray, I think, or Indigo. I always get confused between the two because they're side by side in my palette and they look fairly similar. Again, these are by American Journey. I'm just making the shape a little less blobby. What Jeans Dusty Green kind of tends to spread out, so I was trying to give it a more organic shape instead of looking like a clump of bushes. I want this to resemble a tree line that's receding into the distance, so that's what I'm doing here. I'm just fixing the shape a little as it dries. So Acryla Gouache is like acrylic paints. Once it dries, it dries. It uses an acrylic binder, but the nice thing is that it dries matte. So you don't have that satiny, shiny finish that acrylic paints have. It dries more like traditional gouache, which is water-based medium, just like opaque watercolor. So it looks a lot like regular gouache, but it dries fast, and once it dries, it cannot be reactivated. I like the effect of gouache, but I always have trouble getting just the right consistency to work with gouache. With gouache, if you were to scrub a little, you can always reactivate the layers. And if you're using too much water, then it's very hard to layer with gouache. You have to be careful to keep reducing the amount of water in subsequent layers. And I don't paint much with gouache, so I haven't really got the hang of it yet. This has a fairly smaller learning curve. Once it dries, so it's very freeing to go on top of it and paint whatever you feel like. I put those bits in Payne's Gray at an angle just to kind of um, take your eyes off into the distance, establishing some depth. And you can see I'm going and scrubbing those bits, and still the blue layer stays put. This is very exciting to me. There are so many possibilities now with Acryla Gouache, and the fact that you cannot pick them up no matter how much you scrub at them. You can do night scenes, maybe put a yellow layer and then fill it with some darker colors, and you make it look like fireflies, and there are so many different things you can paint just with a nice underpainting. So again, I'm back to using Ward Jeans Dusty Green, and I'm gonna paint a little path. It's very similar to the golden hour landscape, as I mentioned. So if you were to see that video, you would understand why I'm doing this. I just go in and put in triangles. That's the easiest way to think of it. Flattening them out as you recede into the distance. This all helps convey a little depth. And you can notice here how the underpainting influences what the color looks like. I use the same paint over blue, and you can see how different that looks from the parts that are on the yellow underpainting. This is the beauty of watercolor. It's transparent. It allows the lower layers or the color of the paper to shine through. So this is a great way to make use of watercolor's characteristic and make a lovely mixed media piece. Just making sure the edges are not too hard, but I don't want it all to run into each other, so I'm leaving some parts hard and some parts I'm softening them out. This is my little bamboo brush. I go in and put in grass. Again, make sure to flick in different directions. You don't want all of the blades of grass to be pointing in the same direction. Try and be loose with it. The taller grasses are closer to you. More detail always in the foreground. And as you recede into the distance, less detail. Again, I'm adding a little paint spray, establishing some shadows at the base of these little mounds of grass. In case you're curious, the brush I'm using is a small quill by Roman Schmal. Just adding a little more interest to the midground. So now this is raw umber violet. And I'm just adding a few bits of that to give some variation to the color of the bath. I absolutely love watching colors flow into each other. So I am not scared of muddy colors. In some pieces like this, like loose landscapes, if you watch out a little, you can introduce some muddy parts. It all goes with the composition, but know when to pull back, so the whole thing's not a muddy mess. Just drying the whole thing with my hairdryer. So I dried it with a hairdryer, but not fully. Some of the foreground was still fairly wet, so I'm using my bamboo pen again to flick the darker colors. So this way the grass has some variation in color. If you score the paper, it gives the paint a chance to flow in that direction. So you can see some darks flowing into the light colors. I quite like the effect. So now I'm mixing a greenish dark blue color. I'm going to go in and put in some tree trunks in the background. For this, I'm using a small rigger. Keep your movements nice and loose and quick. You just want to flick your brush up and to the side and at different heights. This is totally up to you. If you like branches that go all the way up, you can make straight lines there. I just like to hint at branches and trunks, so I don't they're just in parts, in places, and they're just quick flicks of the brush. And as you go into the distance, you want to reduce the height of these trees just to convey depth I wasn't very happy with the chunks I put in there, so I'm just scrubbing it and lifting with a paper towel. And now I'm picking up some French grey. You could also use buff titanium or bleed proof white. And I'm adding a few highlights in the background. If you have a thick clump of trees, you will be able to see some trunks, and those usually have some kind of a lighter color that stands out from the darker background. So that is what I'm trying to do here. Anytime you feel you've put down too much pigment, feel free to use your fingers to just blot up some of it, or spread some of it out, blend it out. I do this all the time. And then I follow this up with some French grey splatter in the foreground to add more detail to it. You want to concentrate most of your detail in the foreground. The further you're receding into the distance, try and minimize the amount of detail you add. This helps convey depth. The piece is completely dry at this point, and I'm just going to put the final touches. I'm going back in with Payne's Grey, and I'm adding just a few dots and lines here and there, just to pick things up a little and intensify the shadows and parts. Don't go overboard with this. Again, you stand the risk of adding too much detail in the distance, which is not something you want. In case you've added too much detail, you can always fix that by blending it out a little. So I didn't like the way that background looked, so I'm just fixing some of it. I went back in and put some Ward Jeans Dusty Green, and to not make it look like it's sticking out, I pulled it upwards a little, and then to blend that out, I go in with a clean brush, taking advantage of the wet paper, dropping in a little more green pigment, blending it out, blotting some of that away so it doesn't make a line there. Now it looks like the tree line continues on into the distance. I feel like this has more continuity. Decided to darken up that area a little more, just the base. So I put some dark in and I'm just blending that out. Going back in with my dryer and drying everything. I decided to add more splatter because my previous splatter had kind of dried down and wasn't too visible. So I'm going back in with some French grey, or it might even be bleed proof white. I'm not quite sure. Probably use bleed proof white for the last splatters. And that's it. The piece is done. And you'll see how fantastic this tape is now. Look at that clean edge. I find this tape holds my paper down better than the washi. I still use washi quite extensively, but I have recently started using this tape from Blick and I really like it. I absolutely love the clean edges. So there you have it, that's the finished piece. That's a photograph of it. I'm very happy with how it turned out. I hope you give this a shot and you like it too. And this is the other piece that I was telling you about. The one on the left was made on cold pressed watercolor paper, and I only used turquoise blue for the entire piece as the underpainting. As you can see, the mood is entirely different between the two pieces. So yeah, there's a lot of possibilities.